that, like, why don't you start us off on that, right? When you say in defense of Marxist humanism, I mean, just to kind of start with that on a really basic level, like, what do you mean by Marxist humanism, and then what what is it being defended against?
Sure. Well, Marxist humanism broadly refers to the ethical vision of Karl Marx. If you want to put it even more simply, what Marx thought was essential for human flourishing. And we might go further and say animal flourishing as well, if you're of such a bent, right? Now, for a long time, certainly in Althusserian circles, and for that matter, a lot of orthodox Marxist circles, there was this kind of view that Marx didn't really have an ethics, at least a mature ethics, right? That he had dabbled with some Hegelian ideas about right in his early work, and then that was largely jettisoned by, pick your poison, right? The Communist Manifesto, the Grundrisse, certainly by Das Kapital, right? At which point Marx became a savvy social scientist who might be offering an obstetric argument for socialism, right? That it's going to come about given the contradictions of capitalism that would give way to a higher mode of production, right? But making moral arguments for socialism on this view was taken as writing recipe books for the cookshops of the future. And the more modest objective that I had in this little debate was to point out it's just really not true that Marx ever abandoned ethical humanistic styles of argumentation, right? Certainly less pronounced in the old work. But I opened the essay with a quote from Capital Volume 3, which is about as mature work by Marx as you can get, given that it was written or it was published posthumously, right? So he literally didn't finish it because he died. And he talks there about the realm of necessity giving way to the realm of freedom, suggesting that, look, under capitalism, we've gotten pretty good at developing certain kinds of human powers, right? If you work in a pin factory, to use Adam Smith's example, capitalism will make sure you get pretty good at making pins because it's profitable to do so, at least on part of the assembly line. But capitalism is not particularly good at developing a wide range of human powers. And in Capital Volume 3, Marx says socialism will be different, right? There, the development of human powers and a wide array of human powers will become an end in and of itself rather than just a means for pursuing profit for the first time, right? And he says, the condition for this is in no small part the shortening of the working day, right? You need to have more hours available to people so that they can develop their different faculties rather than just working at making pinheads day in and day out, right? And there are innumerable other examples that you can find pervading his work. Think about the Civil War in France, where he kind of lays out or sketches out a vision for what a communist or socialist society should look like. Same thing as the critique of the Gotha program, right, where he chastises, yes, the utopian socialists for thinking in millenarian terms, but also kind of lays out an alternative vision of what right under a mature socialist regime, post-bourgeois, might look like, right? So moral argumentation and humanist inclinations never disappeared from his work. I agree with David Harvey when he points out that it's always there throughout the texture of the text. You just have to look for it. So that's a less ambitious point of my essay.
Okay, so sorry, which one was the less ambitious and which one was the more ambitious? I think I lost the thread there.
Oh, I just wanted to end in case we wanted to talk about this, but the less ambitious kind of point of the essay was to point out that humanist and ethical styles of argumentation never disappeared from Marx's work, right? It was pervasive all the way up into Capital Volume 3 and the other works that I've referenced, the Civil War in France, the Critique of the Gotha program, and more, right? And so this kind of juxtaposition that people used to make between the humanist Marx or the ethical Marx who matured into the scientific Marx, I think is just a false bifurcation, right? There's definitely a change in accent, and I think his later works are, without a doubt, richer than the earlier ones, right? Certainly a lot more learned, right? But this idea that there's a kind of scientific breakthrough, I think, is just a misnomer.
Okay, so that's the less ambitious point. The more ambitious point is that, like, he's right about that, that the sort of humanistic concerns are ones that, we should continue to care about, or?
Well, I think the more ambitious claim that I was making had two prongs to it, right? The first is that to use the term Cohen's terminology, the obstetric arguments for socialism just aren't going to fly, right? So anyone who's kind of depending upon making the case for socialism on the grounds that inevitably the capitalist mode of production is going to give way to a higher mode of production is going to be waiting for a very long time. You know what I mean? And, there are all kinds of reasons to doubt this. One of the reasons that I kind of gestured to in the book is I really just don't think from a materialist standpoint, certainly consistent materialist standpoint, the obstetric vision has any kind of plausibility to it, right? Once you recognize that we live in material reality without any kind of teleological orientation to history, we can confidently predict that change is going to occur because change is one of the only constants in existence. But the idea that change is going to move necessarily, or dare I say metaphysically, in some direction towards socialism, I just think is completely implausible, certainly post 1989 and 1991, right? And you're familiar with this. This is exactly what Cohen was pointing out in a lot of his later work, where he just said, the reality is we can't just sit there and say socialism's coming, whether you like it or not. Maybe it can come a little faster, maybe it can come a little slower, but one way or another, this is the train you're on, right? So the need to make moral arguments increases, given, the declining popularity of this obstetric vision. But then I think the more important point that I was trying to make is actually a Parfitian one about reason giving, right? Because baked into this obstetric vision, again, was this feeling that one does not need to even argue for the moral superiority of socialism, because it's just taken for granted that given the, I'm jealous of that too, believe me, right? We should all be there, or we should all be so lucky. But given the arc of history, right, the assumption was, well, modes of production get higher and more sophisticated as time goes on, right? So you don't need to make the case for why socialism or communism is going to be better than bourgeois capitalism or feudalism. That's just the direction things go for. I think that that's just a ridiculous view and philosophically completely implausible, right? I think that it rests very, 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 very heavily on this implicit assumption that socialism will be freer and more equal, and that freedom and equality are just good things, obviously, right? And I don't need to suppose that this is what people think, right? I remember talking to Soren Mao, and that's exactly the claim that he made, right? To this day, right? How can you be opposed to more freedom? Well, a lot of people are opposed to more freedom, and a lot of people are opposed to more equality, right? Enormous numbers of people. So it's by no means self-evident that more equality and more freedom are to be preferred to less equality and less freedom. Now, I think more freedom and equality are good things, right? I think the argument for them is undeniable, but we have to make that argument, all right? And I think that just implicitly assuming the superiority of a mode of production on the basis that it's going to secure more freedom and equality is just completely unconvincing on the face of it, right? It relies on an enormous number of assumptions, very few of which are reason-giving in any kind of powerful sense. And to add to that, I also point out that you don't even need to look that far for counterexamples of people who bought into the obstetric vision while also morally denying that socialism would be higher, right? Joseph Schumpeter is just a spectacular example of this, right? Author of Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, kind of a quasi-libertarian with some conservative leanings, very bright guy, right? And Schumpeter used to say, socialism is going to come, and people are going to get more free, and the average person might be more equal, but it's going to be a disaster, right? It's going to be the rise of the mediocre. All transcending values are going to disappear. The kind of vitality of the human race is going to disappear. So when socialism arrives, I hope I'm not there, right? And it's not clear to me why you should object to Schumpeter's characterization unless you can actually argue that more freedom and equality are good, right? There's a necessity in doing that.
Yeah, so I want to bring Conrad in here, but I do just want to make sure, tracking a couple of threads of what you're saying here. So the, obstetric metaphor, the idea there is that this is the sort of classical Marxist metaphor about like the old society is, pregnant with the new one.
Which is a great metaphor, I should say. I'm not knocking the metaphor.
But it's just, I think,
dare I say, a pregnant metaphor. Pregnant.
I think Fidel Castro might have had a memorable update, like in the 70s, maybe sometime, where he said that there's going to be a time when trying to stop revolution from spreading around Latin America was going to be like trying to stop a pregnant whale from giving birth. But whatever else. So on that view, right, the kind of arc of history, toward socialism is set. Maybe there's a question about, how quickly or slowly, right? Maybe there's some room for agency there, or maybe there's the possibility of like a catastrophic miscarriage, that's the sort of thing that's built into like a lot of traditional sort of socialism or barbarism rhetoric, or like even in the Communist Manifesto, the idea
but fortunately history is inevitably very fertile, right? So if one miscarriage happens and socialism doesn't come into the world, the idea was, well, society will just become pregnant with socialism again, and then
we'll try again later. Maybe, I mean, unless there's just such a catastrophic collapse of civilization that there's no coming back from it, which also ties into your point about the morality maybe being irrelevant on this view, because if our choices are some sort of like our socialism or some sort of Mad Max moral breakdown of society, it might not be that interesting a question which one of those is better, right? Like maybe technically you could root for the collapse into barbarism, but it's that's sort of maybe a less interesting issue than if there are more ways the history could go. And the Soren Mao thing, I think maybe teeing up the Conrad part here is interesting, because if you read his book Mute Compulsion, he more or less endorses the Althusser claim that both of you guys have sort of alluded to a little bit, but I mean, just for the sake of anybody who's not super familiar with this idea, right, is that there's the young Marx, like most famously in the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, has these humanistic concerns about alienation and it's sort of inhibited human flourishing under capitalism, and that's what's driving his socialism. And that there's this epistemic break where the older, more scientific Marx sort of puts away all that, and the details are different, right? Mao doesn't just like co-sign what Althusser says, but no. he does say in that book that like he does read the later Marx as moving away from the sort of 1844 views about all that. He does read the later Marx as not sort of having any kind of normative notion of how human flourishing should be that he cares about, and he approves of all that, right? Which so I think, right, this interaction you're talking about with him, because like Mao does make a very big deal about the idea that in various ways capital is dominating us. Mm-hmm. And so there's a sort of question about why we should care about that, right? And so if his answer is just like, well, it's just sort of obvious, right, that that we should care, we certainly shouldn't be interested in kind of doing normative philosophizing about whether socialism would be better than capitalism. Then that's at least interesting as like a major figure in these debates now. But I want to get that.
If I could just follow up on that very quickly, right? I want to say first up, I think his book is brilliant, right? And when I'm criticizing some aspects of orthodox Marxist theory, I'm not suggesting that the critique of power, let alone the critique of political economy, should be sidelined in favor of moral argumentation, right? I mean, I've always said from each socialist thinker according to his ability, to each socialist thinker according to his merits or demerits, right? So if you can make a good moral case for socialism, by all means do it. If you can offer a compelling critique of the mute compulsion of power or economic power the way that Soren does, then by all means do it, right? They see these as complementary projects. What I'm just suggesting very simply, right, is that first off, you really do need to make the case that socialism or communism or whatever will be a freer and more equal society. You can't just rest on the assumption that a higher mode of production will be more free and more equal, and indeed that communism or socialism will be higher. And secondly, and this is more granular, but I think it's no less important, you need to make the case that more freedom and equality are good things, right? I think that too many socialists just assume that they must be, right? Obviously, they're bad, good things, right? But you can go talk to any conservative or indeed plenty of working class people, and they'll tell you, well, what about hierarchies, right? We always need to have someone in charge. How can you just think that more libertine excess is going to be a good thing? Now, I do actually think it's bad that there are too many people in charge. I think that domination is a horrible thing, and we should move towards a freer, more equal society. But the case is not self-evident, and we need to offer compelling reasons for the adoption of those values. And then, of course, in addition to that, show why socialism is the best system for instantiating liberty, equality, and indeed fraternity for all.
Yeah, well, and of course, there are different kinds of freedom, and which one you think is more important is going to make a tremendous difference to where you come down on these issues. But of course we could, sit around here, you and I agreeing about this stuff, but I think it's more interesting to loop in this other perspective. For the record, I would give a little bit more of a mixed review than I think you would to Mute Compulsion, but maybe sometime we'll get Mal on the podcast and talk to him about it directly. But we don't have him here tonight, but we do have Conrad Hamilton, who has a different view on this, right? So this is the second essay in here, Rupture and Reunion, a response to Matthew McManus. So Conrad, I mean, this is clearly that kind of Althusserian critique of Marxist humanism that, like, no, we need to there's something that's like kind of undesirably unscientific about this, or maybe it's not like sort of linked to the right kind of political project in the way that we need, is obviously something you are much more sympathetic to. So you want to kind of lay out that case a bit?
Yeah, no problem. And I just want to say quickly, I find it interesting about Soren Mal, about the Althusserian dimension to Mute Compulsion. Because it's part of, this isn't so much the topic of his book, but I do think it's part of a larger impulse we've seen, which is this sort of odd, convergence, because I think his views are kind of ultra left, right? It's sort of odd convergence between people who have kind of ultra left views with this kind of Althusserian standpoint, which we can see with like Theory Communiste, for example, the French group. But I always think this is kind of an odd thing because, and I actually take this up in the third part of this, which is part of why I'm addressing it here, because I'm not going to talk about it there. But I take it up in the third part of my essay, and I talk about it in relation to Nathan Brown in his book, Rationalist Empiricism, which is a work on Althusser. But it always seems a little odd to me because there's something that remains quite messianic about the ultra left vision, even in its dominant scientific articulations, because there's this idea, right, that we went through the phase of programmatism, right, which was associated with the sort of Fordist era, right, and now we're in this era where the factory, sort of dissolved within the West, or like the site of unionization, and now people are kind of widely proletarianized within the service sector, and it's like, well, now we can, neoliberalism has extended the breadth of capitalist relations, and now we can just go. Like, we don't need this sort of organizational standpoint, right? Everyone can have a spontaneous revolt, right? But it's kind of a strange, strangely messianic prescription for praxis in that way. But that digression aside, getting back to your point, so my essay, Rupture and Reunion, actually, it's the longest essay in the book. It's like 20,000 words, and it's divided into three sections.
It's getting close to being a zero book in itself.
Yeah.
Well, it's divided into three sections, and it does, in a certain sense, there's a kind of fidelity to Althusser, but particularly in the third section, it also, in its own way, advances a kind of critique of some of the limitations of Althusser as well. But yeah, in the first section, I begin and I making kind of invitation to the readers to, take the idea of Marxism as a science at least somewhat seriously, or the idea that it could be. And there are a couple of arguments I make in that respect, and I respond to common points of objection that are made around this. So, the first one is kind of like what I call the Nietzschean argument. So it's the idea that, Marxism is sort of a species updating of Christianity, right? And thus could not be a science. And I point out that this, it treats something, it makes this conflation, right? Marxism with Christianity, for example, based merely on, the commonality of a certain kind of general concern, right? The welfare of the poor, if you will. Not that that is, strictly speaking, the message of Marxism, but whatever. Or socialism. And I point out that, this would be akin to, you think about a situation where, an earthquake happens, right? And, someone purports to explain it by virtue of meteorology, right? And the other person purports to explain it, by virtue of saying, well, it's because there are Jews or Muslims here, right? There's a big difference, right, in terms of the kind of, sophistication of the sort of causal ideology that's being deployed there. So something's elided. And the second point I make in this section, or not in this section, but the section of this section, if you will, is that another major objection is what I call the Popperian argument, right? The sort of falsificationist kind of notion, right? Marxism can't be falsified, and so on. And of course, I think Popper actually did say that Marxism, initially could be falsified, but that its predictions were proven false, right? That was. But what I point out there is that it's very hard in general to use the falsificationist hypothesis to historically understand science. So even if we look at someone like Galileo, I mean, he was kind of like making sort of abductive projections about how a system might function, in the advance of like a real physics existing that could support it. So like this is the thing. I mean, Althusser is not coming from a falsificationist standpoint. He's coming from French historical epistemology, right, which is like French philosophy of science, right? And they reject the idea of a kind of universal meta-science. So for French historical epistemology, science has to retroactively posit the conditions of its own veracity, right? And of course, we know there are enormous differences, right? If you look at, mathematics and biology, and so on and so forth. But I thought this was funny, actually, because in 1989, before he was cardinal, Ratzinger, he gave a speech about, that touched on the persecution of Galileo. And what he basically said is that the church, wasn't wrong to persecute him because, his ideas couldn't be falsified. So I thought that was sort of a, but in any event, that's sort of the preliminary. But the main point of the first section is actually that, one of the things that, I mean, Matt's a little bit vague in his chapter in terms of, he says, like, I'm kind of using, I'm talking not so much about Althusser specifically, but kind of about Althusserians, right? And the crux of kind of the argument that Matt makes, in the first essay is that, we need this kind of moral dimension, right? And in any case, it's very present within Marx's own works. But what I point out in the first section is that, maybe it's a common misunderstanding about Althusser, whether Matt makes it or not, is that he did understand, right, the need for ideology, right? And he insisted on it at many different points in his work. But what he also insisted upon was the need to kind of separate out science, right? So for him, if you look at kind of the whole of reality, it's a very narrow band. Right, so we could talk about geometry, we could talk about physics, we could talk about mathematics. Obviously, he's of the belief that Marxism is the science of history, but most of our reality cannot be, right? And he doesn't think that philosophy, for example, can be, which is why he says that philosophy has no history, right? Because it's only the capacity for scientization that would allow something to create sort of progressive advances, right, as opposed to just being kind of lent out for various political causes, which we can see. Certainly in the history of philosophy. But, really what the point he was making, right, was that, so you need this kind of moral dimension. The moral dimension that he argued for was what he called, exploitation, right? Making the case for exploitation, as the moral dimension of Marxism. But he argued that, the turn to humanism, right, was connected to a sort of deleterious process. Right. So, of course, he objected to not necessarily the denunciation of Stalin as such, but the way that it was done. Right. Because these terms like cult of personality, violations of law, he felt that they were fundamentally sort of bourgeois and superstructural. And that, because it was done that way, one of the troubling aspects of it was it actually allowed the USSR to continue, being to a significant extent what it was under Stalin. Right. Because the critique was actually pursued in fairly superficial terms. More generally, he also felt that, humanism was being used to justify, the demobilization of class struggle, and the, demobilization of class struggle in France as well with the PCF. And that this was connected to the historical content of humanism as a notion, right? Because it's deeply connected with, the emergence of capitalism, the sort of, metaphysical rendition of the individual as a source of commodified labor power, the legal structures that are associated with property, and all of this. So that's sort of the first section of my essay. In the second section, I argue that now one of the things that is important to understand about Althusser's critique of humanism is that he attributes to humanism a kind of continuist standpoint, right? Because for him, it's the idea that, the society, and you could situate it within Feuerbach as well, right? But it's that the society that we're headed toward is already latent within people themselves, right? So we can certainly see this kind of attribution within Adam Smith, for example, who treats, commodity exchange like a kind of, inner faculty of humans that if we allow to flourish, will, through some sort of invisible hand, if you will, engender the best result. And Althusser really rejects this kind of, spontaneist, if you will, ideology.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.